Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to the Explicit Measures podcast. We're here early this morning with Tommy, Seth, and Mike.
For our live audience, yes, but for our normal listening audience on other podcast channels,
that's true.
For 95% of the people,
it must be an interesting listen, right? If I'm on a podcast and all the time, every time we're talking about, hey, we're live and we're pre-recorded.
You're like, you're always pre-recorded.
We're live, and
Yeah.
it's early, and it's like there's a disconnect here. But anyway, welcome to all our listeners.
We're trying to be mindful for all of our audience.
For all the 3% out of, if you actually,
for all three of you, we're trying to be
Very
mindful for
engaging.
2 of you who listen live and 1 of you who listen afterwards.
There's at least 2 listeners all the time, right?
Tommy's
One of us
mom
is talking.
and Mike's mom.
No, one of us is talking, and the other 2.
That's true. That's true.
There's always 2 listeners.
That's true. That's true. Awesome. Well, let's jump in. So I have a couple ideas I want to run by you guys, just because I've been having conversations around how to integrate parts of Fabric with this new PBIP format area. And I had a recent conversation that I thought was very interesting around how do you use a PBIP format when you're a Power BI Pro user? Like your license is literally a Power BI Pro, and you're not using Premium. So I literally had to take a step back and be like, what are you trying to do? And to have the conversation, because I was trying to figure out, it's like the customer was like, I want to use the PBIP format. I want to track multiple changes. I want to build a data model and have people make multiple changes to the data model and then merge those changes throughout the day, or, at the end of the day, merge changes back together. And I was trying to really understand, like, okay, what is your use case here? What's really going on? And so in my mind, I was trying to formulate, okay, if you need to use Git to track your changes, you can totally do so with the Power BI Pro license. Rui just mentioned this month that you can now publish a PBIP project file directly to the service. So you, independently of what happens inside PowerBI.com, I mean, it's easier if you have Premium because the Git integration just works with it, right? You have the Git, button. You can publish reports. You can pull down from Git and make changes. No big deal. But now that there's this idea of you can have an entirely separate Git repo that doesn't even touch Power BI Desktop. So your workflow would be go to the Git or go to your, VS Code, right? Pull down the latest version of code from your Git, open the PBIP file, work on things locally, done, right? It'll automatically change files for you. Great. You can check them back in, put them back on main branch or whatever you want to do. And then you can publish right from the PBIP on your desktop. You still have to publish from your desktop to the service because you can't use the Git integration directly in the service at this point for a pro user. Anything else, Premium per user, anything else, you could still just use the normal, link your workspace to a Git library. What are your thoughts on this? Have you guys explored this at all? Is this something that you've kind of played with a little bit?
Well, to your point, Mike, technically speaking, if I just had access to the repo, I could just push to the repo, and if that's on the right branch, that's going to go show up in the service. It doesn't show who the user is.
Well, it won't show. So that's the one trick I think that's different here between a Power BI Pro licensed user and anything that's in Premium, because you can't link your workspace to GitHub unless you're in
that user. I see. Okay.
You're falling, but the funny thing here, Tommy, is you're falling into the same thing that I was. Like, that's exactly what I went to. I was like, well, this is amazing. Like, use it. Yeah, we love you to use it. And then I was like, wait a minute, you can't get it from desktop or the Git into the service without using Premium
workspace. Yeah,
correct.
Technically speaking, you got people outside your organization working on reports for you. Just put in the repo.
Correct. Yes. Okay, have them work off the repo, right? Build things there and then check out on the repo, and then you're good to go. Anyways, I was just in my mind, I was like, oh, there's an aha moment here. So I think there's almost like a session here around how to work with Git as a pro user, how to work with Git as a Premium user, because the experience between the two, or the process on how you would build and develop things, is going to be uniquely different between those two spaces. Now, there's going to be some similarities, right? You're going to have check-in, check-outs. You're going to have branching. Like, your team, and this is where I was trying to think about, like, what does the team of engineers need to understand? Because Git is brand new to a lot of these business developers. They have,
Yeah.
like they understand a couple words like branching, but like when I went to this, like, let me give everyone one example. I'm getting really excited here. I'm sorry. When you have the model, so again, going really deep into the PBIP format, there is this model.bim file. The model.bim file describes the entirety of the report. Inside the report object, there's also a single file called report.json. These two objects are anything you change on the landscape, the look of the report, add visuals, add pages, the report file will just change. So it's not like Timdal, which is, and this is a format that Microsoft is going to be using eventually for, I think, the PBIP format, but the Timdal format breaks everything down into files that are smaller. That's better for checking in and checking out with Git. The way things are right now, yes, you can use the PBIP format, but when you change something, you get basically two massive files that change, and you have to sift through this really long model.bim and figure out what part of JSON actually adjusted itself when you add columns or change things. Same thing for the report. The report's not broken out into small little files that are easy to check in, check out. So if I make a new page, there's not a file that describes this is the single page I changed, and I can just add that page to my report. It's one big file, and you're merging the same report.json over and over again. So when I was trying to describe this to the customer, they're like, well, this is great. We can use PBIP. I'm like, yeah, but it doesn't really do what you want. Like, it works, and you could definitely come from a repo down, but imagine you have two people making two different branches the same day, and I want to merge those changes back together, right? If someone adds a new data table and someone adds a new column or measure in a different table, it's a lot harder to merge those changes because the merge of changes are coming through a single file.
And I think the worst, maybe not the worst part, but it really relies too on someone really utilizing like VS Code or Dev Studio, because you can't connect to a existing branch after the first time. So let's say I connect to an existing branch. If you're in the source control, you have to go back. You can't do it from looking at just the updates. So you don't know if there's a new branch.
You mean are you talking
Power
about
BI service? In Power BI service.
Oh, correct. Yes.
So that's another thing where.
But that's different. That's a different.
That's part of the process, though, right? I mean, if I'm working on something, I don't want to necessarily publish new because I'm going to see that in the service. So that's a whole other layer here. I'm not saying that's a different part, but a whole other layer here too.
It's going to be. It's kind of tricky. Like I'm trying to figure out what's the best way to go about this. Even thinking through, like, where does Git live inside? Let's imagine you are in premium.
Yeah.
You have dev, test, and prod. Maybe you're using deployment pipelines. What does that look like? How does that work with your? How does that work with your pipeline? And I liken to think here that I'm trying to figure out how do you justify or how do you make sure that each of the branches are doing, or each of the environments are doing code branching correctly? Do you have 3 branches that are dev, test, and prod that match each of the environments? Or do you have just main that lives in all of them, and then you only push reports through to the environments slowly so that we don't accidentally push all changes at once? I think there's still some work here for people to figure out what's the best pattern or what a process would look like to work through this system. I think there's just more exploration there.
I would agree. I mean, especially with the level of complexity, right? That you're introducing, especially for business users, right?
Yes.
And that's kind of how you started this. So I guess and I thought you said there was a question in here, although I
think the question was more like, have you thought about this? Have you experienced
the question
this
was
before?
More, huh?
Yeah.
I guess this falls into multiple buckets, right? Like as a team building Power BI reports.
Yes.
Do you need some sort of version control?
100%. We'd all agree with that.
In a simplified format, there's SharePoint, right? I can revert back to a previous PBIX file or file or whatever and redeploy that to change back to whatever that thing was. So prod is still prod, or that report looked like before somebody snafu'd it.
Yep.
Where that may change is, do you need to know what the specific changes were to the report?
Mm-hmm.
And that's where, like then you're ramping up into this manual Git process.
Yes.
Potentially. But is it worth it? I don't
know yet.
Right. And then the other part of that would be, are you in a situation, and I've been there before, where you have very tight timelines, and you have a lot of reports to build, and you need multiple people working on the same report at the same time.
Yes.
So it would be great, like, to say, okay, part of our process is Git. We're going to break this apart as, we're maybe delineating pages, whatever, but the changes we're going to resync every 4 hours or something to make sure that the model merges together and everything's working. And then we pull again.
Well,
right.
Yeah.
So this is another challenge
that I can see, but then but there's significant ramp up, and we are talking heavy dev tools and heavy processes and procedures on the back end that most business users are not familiar with.
And I think two things too that are important right now. And Seth, I completely agree, because one of the points I was going to say is Git's not more efficient than normal publishing, but it's not meant to be. And I think it's supposed to go through more of that source control, or that the process, the steps. The other
you can see every little thing that changes,
right? But I think it goes the other thing. No one's editing the actual code, and I think that's where it gets usually powerful.
You're not.
You're going through the JSON.
I don't write in desktop anymore. I just go right to the code. I just write it
out.
Yeah.
Good luck with not even Tyndall yet. Yeah. Sure you do. Yeah. No intelligence. Crap. That thing. I could just see you right there. Like, let's see, where's that one bar chart?
I need a new visual. I need to write 60 lines of code to get that to work.
JSON. Yeah. Okay. You know what? Hats off to you. But still, like, you know what I mean? But there's no efficient coding right now with just, in a sense, files. It's still, you have to either use like Tableau Editor, or you're opening a Power BI desktop. And I think that's where the disconnect is with Git being efficient with Power BI. It is cool. I can see all those things.
Yes.
But I'm not really going in right now, and I'm reviewing it, but I'm not necessarily going to go and build 5-10 measures or build another report page within the Git file.
And I don't think people will do that until they get to right. So when Tyndall shows up, it takes the single massive file that describes the model, model.bim, and breaks it into many different files that are easier to describe per table.
But still no disconnect. But
way better.
No IntelliSense, unless somehow they integrate like the BIM model there. If you're writing another,
they're supposed to be doing that. Like that's something that I believe there's an open project right now from Microsoft to make Tyndall an actual readable format and make it so it auto detects what's going on in there. Okay. I know this was a very long intro. I was just having a lot of head thought around premium pro users and the integration with Git. And I think there's a lot of value here. I'm not sure it's for every project, like you said, Seth. And I don't think it makes sense to have it for all users. I think there's going to be a very focused area of development that needs to be taught and educated on what Git is, how to best use it. And to your point, Seth, I'm just really nervous with people turning this on, just because if someone takes a branch out and waits, 2 days, a lot can change in a file in 2 days. So are you constantly pulling the changes back down to you locally? Are you constantly, it's just, there's going to be more problems with this, and you're gonna have to figure out what happens when the Git will not let you commit back because there's a conflict.
And don't forget, you can still publish the PBIX and it will convert it back to PBIB. So you can completely also circumvent it too.
Yep. So anyways, all right, enough of that. Let's move on to our main topic today. So our main topic kind of relates a little bit here. This also talks about kind of like, this is more of like a governance administration type topic. We are now getting this new thing called Fabric. Fabric now shows up to our environments now, and we have the ability to add a data scientist, a data engineer into our workflows. There's these new workflows. We have notebooks now. We have lakes. There's more artifacts, I will call them, that are now living inside Power BI. There's now data activator, Custo, Synapse pipelines, like all these extra things that we've never had. Very good for the business user perspective, because now there's more options for you to build things. So business users, get ready. You're going to need to start learning things. That's part of this problem. But on that thought, now that we're bringing more data engineering tools into the Fabric ecosystem, how do we govern this? Like, to me, there was this previously on the episode of Power BI, there was this whole dashboard, report, and data set. Like, those were the three main things I was interested in negotiating. Where do I give people access to? Do they get access to the workspace, or do they get access to a data set? Or do I publish an app to not put people in the workspace. So everything in the Power BI.com experience kind of felt like there are different layers of access that I'm going to provide to people, right? I'm going to provide you access to a report that you can see it with an app, or we're going to go even further down and say, okay, I'm going to let you have access to a data set and build your own artifacts on top of that. What we've just now added is 3, 4, I don't know how many more new things to govern and control. How's this going to affect how many workspaces we build? What does this look like in context of the medallion architecture, bronze, silver, gold? So that's kind of the topic for today. Kind of open, curious your thoughts on how this works. Tommy and Seth, do you guys agree with kind of what, what's your perspective on what is Fabric adding here and how do we govern it or control it? I'll kick it over to Seth here. What do you think, Seth?
What do I think? I think many things relevant to this conversation. I don't know how many. I think what workspaces in Fabric are stretching here is if you outlined all the different ways in which Power BI itself was governing how we share content to end users, this is like, it almost seems like we have that a stretch in the other direction now, right? Mm-hmm. There are many types of content creators within Fabric that are part of these workspace ecosystems. And are we driving more towards like, how do we potentially have to alter the way in which we created workspaces for end user sharing versus now we have like workspaces that encompass many parts of the data analytics ecosystem, creation of data for reporting,
yes,
as well as that same reporting, right? So to me, it's not, we're not incorporating or challenging like the way in which we share content, because that's still done the same way,
correct,
from a push out perspective. But are you saying that because of all these new groups of people that are part of an ecosystem, and because the way Fabric works across that is by expanding workspaces, right?
Yes.
Because a workspace really was just a container for, to your point, reports and data sets, right?
Correct.
It was the final product.
Yes.
And now it's a kind of an avenue across the data estate, right? For all of it to happen. So it's I think we kind of talked about this a little bit in terms of the roles and things, but are you challenging the idea that we would potentially need more workspaces assigned to the same business unit to separate out the content builders versus what we have for content sharing?
That's a great question. Let me give you some more scenario here that might help round out that question a bit more. Let's add just one new persona into our ecosystem, the data scientist, right? So we have this concept of data sets and reports right now. We've added this context of a data scientist. A data scientist is going to potentially use notebooks and build things inside the notebook experience, but they need access to information and or data. So one of the best practice guidances right now, kind of prior to Fabric, was, hey, you probably want, if you're going to go enterprise data, you're probably going to want a workspace of just data sets, right? You have, dev, test, prod of just where you store the data sets. And then you're going to pair that with another workspace that is dev, test, prod for just the reports. So now I can version the data sets independently of the reports. I can control access to the team that builds just the report side, and then I can give very metered access to the data sets. So the data sets and the reports basically had their own kind of, pipelines to get things matured. Now incorporate this concept of the lake house. So do I want my lake houses to live in the same space as the data sets? Does that make sense? Does it make sense to have dev, test, prod of those things? If I'm this data science person that's showing up to this, what data should they touch? Do they need access to the data set, the workspace, or the entire lake house environment? So does the lake house or lake houses, however you want to build that, as you build data in tables or build data in that engineering space, do those lake houses now become another pipeline? So before I was managing 6 workspaces. Do I now manage 9? Because now I have this whole thing of lake houses that I care about. So this is kind of where I'm going. Is I feel like there's a potential area here. We have to be more. I'm trying to design the workspaces in a way that makes sense to not make too many workspaces, but is easy enough to manage and controllable enough to give direct access to the things that we need to have access to. Which lakehouse? Does that make sense? What I'm trying to say? Like, does that resonate there?
Yeah, and there's also the complete conversation on the organization of the artifacts too. Honestly, with all the things kind of being brought up, there's a complete evaluation that needs to occur from the ground up on the design of a workspace in terms of not just who, but what goes in there. And
Correct.
not even if you took out the dev test prod, which not saying you would, but even if you took that out of the equation, the amount of artifacts going into one workspace from like one notebook, one lake house, and a data flow.
Correct.
And now trying to incorporate into there as well, say reports and dashboard. If we took a step back and looked at the ground up when we used to create a workspace or what we would recommend, it was usually from an organization like 10 to or 5 to 15 reports meant for the collaborators building report and for the app audience. That was the only 2 considerations, right? They usually had in terms of what would go in a workspace, generally speaking.
Yes, I think I would agree with that one. But again, I'm going back to this data science experience.
Right, exactly. But I'm saying now
what data do they need? Do I build a single workspace that is only lakehouse related? And in that lakehouse, the lakehouse in itself has its own concept of like raw data, silver data, gold data, right? So you even in the context of a lakehouse, you have this idea of like maturing and building and grooming this data down so it's actually more, enriched, right? So do you want your data scientist showing up to a workspace where you have data sets that are in production and data lakehouses that are in production? Do you want them in there? I don't think you do. I don't think you want your data scientist in that workspace. So what I'm saying is you may want to give them access to those data, but they may have a separate workspace that's just a test workspace. And maybe that other workspace for the data scientist, again, I don't know what they need or what they're going to do with their job, but that person could be wanting to connect to data in dev, data in test, and data in production to do some sort of analysis, or only want that one workspace to only touch things that are in production. So now that you have this notebook that's built with data science, how do you now work that notebook into the production pipeline? Where does that go? So there's all these extra stories, I think, that are occurring now in how I want to provide direct access at various points in this pipeline. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think it starts with the core, right? And when I mean the core is, are we utilizing lakehouses? Are you utilizing SQL databases throughout this process? Because you may be doing SQL databases still. You may not do lakehouse, right? And that's going to, I think, dictate a lot. If it's lakehouse, let's say.
I'm going to challenge you a little bit on that. I think, yes, the answer is correct. But I think if you're going to be getting involved with a SQL database, right? I think that's still an area that we would call that's still very centered inside IT at this point, right? So you'd have to integrate. Again, I'm not questioning that you would or would not use them. That's not my question here. I'm just thinking about what are the things that a business user, like when I get into Fabric, what can I create there? 100%, there will be SQL databases we're going to need a link to. We'll get data out of them. Like that makes sense. I totally agree with that. But I don't think a Fabric user is going to come in and trying to turn on a SQL database anywhere because there's no capability to do that today inside Synapse. Well, yeah, but that it's kind of a SQL database, but it's kind of not though. Like I'm not sure I would want to use SQL serverless. So I think of that SQL server as SQL serverless. You get a table, you can make databases, you can make data there, but I'm not sure I'm convinced that I want to spend a lot of time on that because I don't know. My hesitation here is the SQL database is a more expensive, more enterprise grade solution. The Lakehouse is still very enterprise grade, but I think it's a more lower cost solution when we're talking about reporting of data. I think of SQL as more transactional in nature, as opposed to So SQL serverless makes a lot of sense because when you access the data, it turns on, you access the information, and then it turns off and goes away. You don't get billed 24/7 for that machine. I'm thinking of a SQL server in more of a traditional sense. It's you turn it on and it's on for 24 hours a day, 365.
And I would agree with you, but I think knowing the situations you're going to run into also.
Yeah.
At the end of the day,
What are the paths right now? Like we're talking about workspaces that for like dev test prod for final reports. But at the same time, like, is there anything in Fabric that allows me to easily deploy, like if I have a test environment and I'm building things in there to deploy to a production workspace? Like that when you talk about test and prod to me, right? Like that is not functionality that I'm aware of. That like, oh hey, you know what? We have this like one massive environment and everything just lives in it, and we're going to segment things out. But how, if you're trying to lock people into non-prod environments, how do they deploy to prod? How would they deploy from one workspace to another?
I don't know. I haven't linked up. This is something I haven't tried yet. I haven't tried making multiple workspaces. I don't know what artifacts move through the deployment pipelines at this point. And if it doesn't pick up everything yet, I would imagine it's eventually going to pick up everything.
So as you're talking, I'm going to leave test and prod out of this right now.
Okay. Yep. Let's just talk about Fabric for a moment.
There's a concept here where can I make an argument that in this environment there is probably a workspace that I call like core engineering or core data science that are going to be working across all of the data within my ecosystem that I'm pulling into Fabric.
I think the answer is yes for that. I think that will happen.
And these are the people that are creating the layers, right? Like I'm doing the raw. It's bronze, whatever you want to call it, the 3 layers, bronze, silver, gold,
whatever you want to do. Yep.
And then what happens is it's highly in my mind, if I'm going down this path, these engineers have access to all the data, and then business units. Ultimately, we're going to be creating data marts or segments of some of this data, or data that's supplementing potentially what a business unit is doing in their workspace, right? But that like there's got to probably be some sort of symbiotic relationship, or like we're all sourcing from the same place of data. Otherwise, you're going to find yourself in silos again.
Yes, correct.
And in that environment, if I'm in the business unit workspace, maybe it's just a matter of like those, like either they have their own engineers, or the engineers that have access to core also have access to that workspace, and they're doing the business unit work in that full flow, and everybody has access to everything. Because in that case, then you're enabling business users on the very front end who may not be aware of these things initially now, but you would be opening up the door of like, oh man, something doesn't look right in this report, but we've cataloged this. We know that here's how it all works, and I have access through all of this, so I can trace where the breakdown is happening, because it's all part of my purview. And I think that's one of the challenges where, as independent services right now in Azure, most people don't have that.
Yes.
Right? Like they don't have access to something, or they can't do something. Now, like this opens the question of like, should they? Right? Like
I don't know.
If they were supposed to have access.
Now, without training or education, I would say no.
So I guess like I guess the challenge here is like, do we just open up the workspace to the existing users that we would have, that would the normal BI developers anyway, that would be generating the reports? And I'd probably argue, yeah.
Well, I think this, Mike, I'd love you to answer a question here, because I think this dictates a lot of this. How large is then a single lake house? How many reports in a sense does it encompass? Is it acting like a single data set for multiple reports, or are we going to have multiple data sets off of it? Is it treated as like a department level lake house? Are we creating multiple lake houses? This is
a great question.
Is going to, I think, also dictate how large that workspace or what's in that workspace.
Yeah, but wouldn't that be something that you would stick in a core location, and then you would share?
That's what I'm thinking.
Those data sets to the other workspaces.
Well, and this is
like,
is where
you're sharing the component. Like they don't need to see all the layers.
No.
But do all of those other workspaces have access to the gold layer? Probably.
I would imagine, at least in my head, that maybe you have a larger I'm not sure of the size yet, but the lakehouse would serve multiple data sets, and we're utilizing
I would hope so.
Yeah, and
again,
we're utilizing the shortcut feature to the other workspaces.
But again, oh man, this is getting good.
Yeah, but you also don't want 10, like how many, like 20 lake houses in a workspace with all the artifacts. That's from an unmanageable point of view too.
Not sure I agree there yet. So lake houses are designed to be super big, by their design.
Right.
So, the idea here is I need to figure out a way to allow people to. So let me say it this way. The way Microsoft has described the lake house, in my mind, in my mental model, they describe things wrong. The language they're using to describe one lake versus lake house versus data sets, in my mind, is different. If I had to take this from a equivalent SQL standpoint, I would say one lake is technically the one lake icon. That is technically the lake house. The idea of a lake house is this massive thing that where all your data lives. You can search from it anywhere, and you're now giving permissions down to table level details on things, right? So that is the concept of one lake. When we talk about a lake house, the way that Microsoft describes it, I think of that as being the equivalent of the database. So the one lake is equivalent to the server. The lake house is equivalent to a database. So if you're a SQL developer, that's how my mental model works here. The server can host many databases. Now, when we go into this concept of lakehouse, right, you'll have these areas of enrichment of data. And in the same way that I'm doing metered access to production, and I'm thinking, in the production environment, everything's read-only, right? Production is a read-only environment for reports and data sets. Yes, you can connect to them, but you're not making changes on that stuff. You're doing those changes somewhere else, making sure those changes are good, and then bringing it to that production workspace. So I feel like the same thing happens around the lake houses. So the lake house, you'd have this medallion architecture, bronze and silver. They're usually not in a place. Those tables are not ready to go for people to use them. So those areas are usually relegated to only developers. And only after we get things through into a final state, the gold layer, that's when we want to start exposing things to a broader audience. So again, I'm just trying to think, like, you either throw everything in one workspace and then manage so nobody has access to the workspace, but you manage everything with access via, security groups. I'm going to add the security group permissions to this lakehouse in this workspace. Or you give some more capability and you add more contributors to the workspace to allow them to actually work inside those fabric elements. And so this is where I'm having a lot more thought around this, because there's just so many more options here now. And if I think about, like, let's just talk about data flows, data sets, and Power BI. So data flows, data sets, and reports. The report level access is one layer of access. If I want to give more access, I could give access to the data set, which means now I have a relationship model. I've got measures. I'm giving you other data. It's still enriched. It's still better than just raw tables, but I'm giving you some more access. You could even go even further and say, I'm going to give you raw table access now as well. But the table access was like things that are coming out of a data flow. And if you're not using data flow, then that isn't relevant to you. So if you think about those layers, you have table, data set, and report. Now we've added maybe one layer before that is now lakehouse, or maybe those tables no longer live in data flows, and now you have this lakehouse structure that could have many more tables, and then take that table architecture and say, okay, well, there are different quality level tables. There's a bronze, silver, gold data in that area. So what level of those tables? It just gets so much more evolved here, and you really need to have a strategy around what do you care about and what are you allowing people to have access to? Because I don't think you want to give access to everyone right day one out of the box, because it's just going to turn into a big mess of stuff. It's just going to get more messy than it already is.
Because, like, and clarify for me, because security currently is set up, like, once is on the workspace level, right?
Well, that's one layer of security. Yeah, you have security at right today, right? Yeah. You have security at the app level, audiences, apps. That's one layer of security. There's two layers of security. Then you go down to the workspace security level, and then you now have security individually onto the data set. So I can give you access to the data set without giving you access to the the
What about
workspace.
but all the work, if I'm part of a workspace in Fabric and we have a lakehouse, and that is part of my workspace, is that user defined at the moment? I know that like it's going to be at some point, isn't it?
I believe you can actually manage permissions down to the lakehouse already. So in the same way you can manage permissions to the data set. So nobody has example, prod workspace. I have a data set. I can not give anyone access to the workspace, but I can give them access to have build permissions on the data set, meaning they can go build their own Excel sheets. Same thing happens at the lakehouse.
What's the experience where, and you guys have played with this more than I have. If I build a lakehouse in a workspace and I share access or share table to a different workspace, can that other workspace build on top of the lakehouse, or or is it like creating?
You create
You create your own repository of data that like virtually links to that table.
I know. Yeah.
Herein lies my predicament. So I think the answer is yes, Seth. I think so. The answer is you could build more
your own thing in your
correct
space.
So this is why I think, oh man, this is getting good. Okay, so shortcuts to other data set is very relevant because I can have one table of truth and I can give that table to other team members.
Multiple.
Right.
But when you're giving access to a lakehouse, you can then give access. And again, I think one security might address this more fully in the future, where I can actually give access to an individual table object inside.
Yeah,
so
it won't matter what workspace you're in. These objects themselves understand who you are and what permission levels you should have.
Exactly right. But right now, again, because we don't have one security at the table level or even the file level, right? So imagine folders in the files, because a lakehouse has files and tables. The files area could have a folder, and you can provide access to a folder for people to then read. And if I look right now at the access permissions for Fabric right now at a lakehouse level, if you add permissions to lakehouse, you can add read all SQL endpoint data, read all Spark data. So I can provide read level access to different compute engines to an individual user. So the idea being, I could have a separate workspace that I do build things in. I could make shortcuts to this data sets and have that appear in my other workspace. So this to me, at some level, this gets very. This could be very much a problem for organizations, because if you start exposing the lakehouse itself and allowing shortcuts to be made everywhere, anytime you change those tables, if you delete columns, you now have a wider impact potentially of deleting or removing or adjusting other people's data in other places. It gets more squirrely.
Not really. Like you can't modify unless you have permissions on those core data sets. You wouldn't be able to modify them.
But what in a read-only data set, if I delete a column and you're using it, then you have a problem.
Oh, you're saying downstream effect.
Downstream of that, yeah. So that's like
there's two parts of this that I'm torn on, right?
Okay.
One is okay from a build standpoint. If I was starting from scratch, right?
Yeah.
All of us are, right?
All of us. Clean environment, no mess.
Brand new companies all over the place. Is the okay, I have a core data set, I can share that with people, and then you're integrating your business user, right? Like the people who with all the domain knowledge, and you're building out your data mart, right? And it comes from the same core data. I think that makes sense, right? Then that belongs in the workspace. It's great. But what's missing here is, how do I certify that? And or how do I reuse what they're creating in other parts of the environment? Like it's almost like what should be happening, or what should happen here is, like, if we're creating a lakehouse for the organization as a source of data, and then we're building out different cuts of it, called a data mart, right?
Yeah.
How does, like, what's the path to get that back into core, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that, hey, like, great, I want these people to manage it, but they shouldn't manage it in this workspace silo, right? Like it should be part of an overall thing that everybody can use. And it shouldn't be, unless the environment is just going to work so well that it's like, oh, we share this content with you. Now these people who have created this additional content with dependencies on this are sharing this with you.
You're going to need more lineage.
You're going to create a third version of this.
Yep.
And that's going to be shared with the organization, unless all of this is just like, here's shared stuff that you can use. But then there's the governance question that we quickly go into, is like, who owns what? And maybe that does work though. right? Maybe it does work that like, hey, I have a core. This business unit owns whatever happened over here.
Yep.
And they're sharing this content and they're saying this is their certified content out of their business unit. Maybe that does work because then you have the clear ownership. It's just segmented in a way I think that makes me nervous. Like typically from where I built things in the past. But if there is a path here where it's like, okay, I have core, the workspaces for this business unit, they have their own people, or people within there are using the business unit's knowledge to create these artifacts.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe those artifacts do live there, but you would definitely need to know in a corporate strategy that this is how you're going to go about implementing things so that when things break, and it's going to be really challenging it's going to be really challenging to modify anything too. To your point, what if somebody removes a column? What if the update happened in core and every data set across workspaces uses the same thing? How do you test that? And now you throw in dev test prod. All right, good conversation, guys. I'm fully confused.
Tommy, I think if anything, I think you're going to make a couple comments. We'll wrap here. Tommy's got to run off to something, so let's wrap it up here. I will say is, if anything, all I take away from this conversation is there is now more importance than ever to have a strategy around if you're going to use Fabric, you need to think about what does governance look like. And I think from your comment, Seth, it's going to be more important for us to identify data owners or data stewards of these different artifacts and making sure that we have, don't just add everyone as admin on everything. That's going to create more problems. All right. With that, this has been a very quick conversation. Thank you all very much for jumping in here and talking to us about Fabric things and things around Fabric. This is a topic that we will likely have to re-explore over and over again. It's going to evolve as Microsoft adds more things around Fabric. Our only ask to you guys as the team here is can you please share this content with somebody else? If you like this, if this was thought-provoking, if it helped you think through Fabric a little bit more around how you govern and administrate your various artifacts, give it a share. Let someone else know you enjoyed this one. Tommy, where else can you find the podcast?
You can find the podcast anywhere they're available: Apple, Spotify, YouTube. Join us live if you want. For the majority of you are listening, but also you can subscribe too. Make sure to do that. Leave us a rating. If you have a question, a topic, or something you want us to talk about, you can head over to Power BI Tips on our beautiful website. Leave us a question and we'll talk about it maybe. And then finally, we'll see you next week.
Sounds good. We'll see you next Tuesday. Sounds good. Bye.